I'm sorry about the late start. Just as I was going to start, I discovered my file only had 6 pages, and that's a little less than I was planning to present today. But I think now I have them all. Welcome back. We have a variety of things today. Here's the, well, looking back, last time we wrapped up sequence labeling or sequence or tagging. In passing, reflected on dynamic programming and applied the general techniques of dynamic programming to the Viterbi algorithm. And today, I'll put my batteries back into my remote and hope that it still functions. Today, I'd like to use about 10 minutes or so to look with you jointly at the feedback you have given us, then introduce one more algorithm in the hidden Markov model space, then celebrate and run a quiz, slightly different in setup and motivation from the Kahoot quizzes, and then ideally, starting in the second half of today's session, possibly a little later than that, move on into our next segment, which will be on syntactic structures. Before I start going through this program, are there any immediate questions or comments we should take jointly? That is not the case just now, so what have you told us? So here is what we see. Only 24 of the 61 that we invited to give feedback have taken the time to do so. That's often the way it is. Sometimes we actually give bonus points just for submitting the questionnaire, but I guess 1/3, a little more than 1/3 is not terrible. I think for the last obligatory assignment there were 50 some who actually submitted, so they are between, I think there are around 55 active students from what I recall. So the warm-up questions we usually ask to make you reflect a little on your own attitude about the course. And looking at the large proportion of people who say they often come to the lectures, in our group of respondents, it would seem that those who actually come to the lectures also took the time to, or many of you guys actually went through the questionnaire, and I'm tempted to interpret that as a stronger sense of involvement with the class, and that's of course what we would like to strengthen. There's a larger proportion of people who go to the lectures than to the laboratories. Tempted to ask, why do you find it less useful to go to the group sessions? I mean, those of you who don't attend almost all laboratories. Is there any? I mean, I understand time is at the essence. We're now approaching both the end of the semester and Christmas in parallel, so you need to budget your time. But I think Seaver is actually a pretty good group teacher, and specifically the review of model solutions I would expect should be very useful, and also the ability to get practical help working on assignments. So that's, I think Siva reports currently there are 10, 12 people attending the groups, so about half of those who come to the lectures. So you don't find it convenient to actually go to the group session those 2 hours and use those 2 hours to work on your assignment. And should a problem come up, have Seaver immediately available or someone next to you. That's the model that we think we propose, but it doesn't seem to work out that way. Other thoughts? Yes?
Also, in some of the group sessions, he spends a lot of time going through the previous assignment, and if you already did it and got it correct, you don't need to go there. I feel like.
Okay, okay. So you've scored 9 out of 10 points, and you don't feel I actually need the review.
Yeah.
He won't tell me anything new. Hmm. Okay, so maybe actually a little less time. But I mean, others, I mean, those who just scrape together 5 or 6 points might have a different view on that. Yeah. You were going to say something in the back. Yeah. Okay. Seems like a plausible strategy. Most of them get answered quickly. So Piazza actually undercuts or reduces the value of the group session. That's both good and maybe not our ultimate intention. Okay, would you like, how many of you would think that if there were more regular yrkesoppgaver, weekly additional, well, not assignments, but problems, questions to work on in the group, would that help? Would that be welcome? Things you don't submit, things that just sort of cause you to reflect further on the topics that we're introducing. Anyone? This is open space, so we're honestly interested in, but not many, because we're taking enough of your time anyway. Well, do we really? Ha ha. I'm not sure whether Eric gave you the initial spiel. So you're full-time students. You work 38 or so hours each week. Take 3 courses. That's 12 point sum that you owe us each week. The lectures take 2. Since you're not going to the laboratories, and few people actually use more than 10 hours, it's not obvious we're taking too much of your time if we sort of take all of this at face value. Yeah. Yeah, and it's of course not, I mean, this is thinking average, and of course weeks with a submission coming up, you'll use more time, and then the following week maybe you'll take a breath, and you may have other constraints on your time. That's just the sort of the reasoning that we apply, and I think we actually believe, honestly, personally, that we should be enticing you to use about 12 hours each week on average on this course. 10 study points is a lot. So on many other countries, universities I know of, courses typically are smaller. They give 5 or 7.5, even in Norway, even in computer science. 10 study points is a fairly substantial course. So it should be a big part of your semester. You were going to say something? You're flattering us. Okay, I'll take it home. In fact, Eric says hi. He's not here so that we can talk freely about the first half of the course. um, that's a good thing. So thank you for the flattery. Of course, there's the challenge of making the connection between the lectures and what ultimately at one point will interest you most, the exam. And we actually put many of the theoretical questions on our assignments come from previous exams. So that's something we started doing a couple of years ago, not only implementation, but also theoretical questions on these assignments. So you don't program at the exam. So sort of by nature, there's more theory there than in the rest of the semester. And so we're trying to establish that link through having one or two theoretical questions on each assignment. But weekly yrkesoppgave exercises would potentially be more in the sort of theoretical space. They would not be programming exercises. So it's pencil and paper. We are certainly not yet participating in the sort of computer exam pilot. And hence there won't be serious programming. But we might ask you to sketch a procedure, and we might say, if you don't remember the syntax of Lisp, then feel free to insert a little bit of pseudocode here and there. So it won't be heavy on the programming language. Likely. Honestly, I can't tell you yet. But we will, in fact, I think we probably have posted already at least one exam from the previous year. And if you go back to earlier years, you can sort of string back. So each course page should have one sample exam, which is typically the previous year's exam. So you can certainly observe what the tradition is. Okay, I'm sorry, but I feel like both rushing a little through this so that we don't use 45 minutes and still getting your input. So I'm a little ambivalent maybe. This is of course what we would like to see, and we try reasonably hard to communicate clearly. I often feel like saying significance when we ask you about the significance. Ultimately, I imagine that's hard for you to judge, but at least we give you a sense that we're not teaching you irrelevant stuff, and that's good. And take my word for it, it's very significant. it's going to be very useful stuff. Makes you better people. Now it's getting interesting. Some of you complain that we're not giving you the middle of the road answers. Some of you maybe suspect that's deliberate. I want to try and force you into taking a stand, even if you're maybe a little more on the one side, on the other side than where you can actually be. But overall, you say the course is a bit hard. And then there's an almost even distribution of people who find it really difficult, which I think if there was a majority saying really difficult, that would be a problem. Likewise, if a majority of people said a bit easy, or even half, that would be throwing out study points without justification. So this is exactly where we want to be. Does a bit hard to you mean harder than the average master course you're taking? Who thinks that this class is harder than the other master courses you have taken at this department so far? Some who think it's easier? That's pretty balanced, okay. Unless you tell me otherwise, I'm happy with this result. And I also like going through the summary so that you actually also get to see it and get some idea of what the spread is, and then you can for yourself ask, okay, where am I in this picture? Here you actually surprised us. Me specifically. Eric, a little, though he had already articulated for himself the goal to maybe cut back or go through the vector space part a little faster next year. Again, the sort of peak is where, of course, we want it to be. Leisurely, we interpret as at an appropriate pace. Not hasty, but not boring you. I was worried that I was actually going too slow. And from the few, I mean, you only had 3 half lectures to actually judge, and I think the first was, I believe, pretty slow, a slow start. And so apparently last week, at least some of you felt I was actually going through a wealth of material somewhat fast. Eric and I talked about this. Honestly, I must say I also suspect that it may be that on average, he just presents more clearly, more understandably than what I have managed so far. And we didn't ask you about that, but of course, if you sort of sit in the lecture and don't immediately grasp everything I tell you, then you might feel he's actually going a little fast. But maybe it's actually underlying that I could have presented better, that I could have polished my slides more or explained better. I would honestly have to say I'm not perfectly happy with my current set of slides. They are still subject to refinement, whereas Eric has done his part more often actually now than I have done mine. This is what I take home from this. If you want to comment, now is the opportunity. I'll certainly not go slower than I have so far. I also think that we are increasingly getting into space that to the vast majority of you is new territory. We routinely ask about these. Eric said you can drop these questions. We know the answers. And again, this is what we would like to obtain. We want to challenge you a little, and that's what we put into a bit hard. Above my head, we don't want too many of you having that impression. And I think I can't speculate about those cases where you feel we're asking too much, I guess, or I mean, whatever. It's actually that still there are a few more a bit easy than we strictly speaking aim for. The books, no unmoderated excitement, or very little unmoderated excitement. They're all beginning to be slightly dated. Jurevsky and Martin are working on a 3rd edition of their book. Several of you have seen it in other courses. They seem to be doing an okay job, and the way we set up the course, we're not following one book very closely. We pick chapters and sections from books that support the story that we're actually telling. And several, I think a couple or so in the textual comments said, haven't looked at those books yet, so it's hard for me to judge. That's a little moderately disconcerting. But I expect that as the exam approaches, I certainly recommend that all of you turn to those books and actually go through these parts that we ask you to read, that we consider the pensum, the obligatory curriculum. A couple, maybe 3 said there are many practical assignments. There's a lot of out-of-class work. Since we're only lecturing 2 hours, that's the predominant model at this department. I've worked in Germany and in the US, and in comparison, there are fewer lecture and phase hours in this study program, I think in general at Norwegian universities than in those countries. And that means we need to find other means to engage you. And that's through the assignments. So bear with us. It's for your own best. We're parents, we mean well. Yes, so generally, there are sort of small things that we'll take home. Erik and I actually looked at this yesterday. There was another batch of comments that I actually haven't read all of these because many came in since yesterday when I looked at it last. But we're fairly happy with the feedback, but there are small suggestions here and there that we'll try to accommodate. So this is what we see. We'll post this to the course page so that you can also have a deeper look. Any final comments? Was this worth the effort? Who thinks this was worth the effort? It's hard to say no to that question, of course. So about half. Yes, we're still looking for the right way of balancing investment of time and useful information that we actually extract from this. But it's also, so the effect of actually giving you this summary, I think, must not be underestimated. So if you felt trivially easy, well, maybe nobody did that, then it might help you to see that that's a minority opinion. Alrighty, so enough about the halfway evaluation. Let's go back to algorithms, natural language processing, artificial intelligence. So I have 4 slides that contain material you've seen before. This is going all the way back to n-gram language models because several of you actually commented on that, also on Piazza. So estimating the parameters, the n-gram probabilities, we do by maximum likelihood estimation, setting the count of the actual trigram in proportion to the prefix bigram is what we said. And at the time, I think I already said, but didn't spell it out, the count of I like will be the same as the count of all trigram, the sum of counts for all trigrams that start in I like X. Then we added Laplace or add one smoothing to work around data sparseness and said we shift a little bit of the probability mass to unseen events. That is, we assume that all counts are at least 1. So even an unseen event will have a count of 1. We just add 1 here. And then, somewhat magically to several of you, we said, that means we now need to normalize to the same term as before, but add V, which is the vocabulary size, the number of distinct words. And that's something you asked us to explain in more detail, because it turns out I was wrong. Girafsky and Martin don't either. And here is now written down what I think in a hand-wavy way I had told you in that lecture. So this term here, the normalization term, I have now broken down using the same expanded version that I introduced up here. So we sum trigram counts with the bigram prefix and the third element W for all words, all W, from the vocabulary. And of course, to each count we add 1. So how often do we add 1 in that sum? V times. That's how we derive this version here. All right. I think I'll click through this. You seemed reasonably comfortable with the basic notions of dynamic programming, and recognized Viterbi, or the problem that we were solving, decoding in a hidden Markov model as a dynamic programming problem. Recursively decomposed in subproblems, repeated computation of partial solutions, reuse of those. And then we introduced the Jason Eisner summer 2007 in Baltimore situation, and formalized that as a hidden Markov model, essentially a state transition diagram, where here we have two states, hot and cold, temperature on a given day, the pseudo-state start of sequence, end of sequence, and probabilities for transitions going from one state into another. That's essentially the hidden sequence, hidden to us because we only know how much ice cream Jason ate on any given day. We don't know what the weather actually was. And for each state, we further have the emission probabilities. That is the pairing of observations, 1, 2, or 3 ice cream consumptions on that day, given the temperature of the day, conditional probabilities that for each state add to 1. So that's about the simplest hidden Markov model that we can assume, and it has transition and emission probabilities. And to assign probabilities to a state sequence given an observation sequence, we instantiate the chain rule and search for the sequence S1 to Sn that maximizes this term, where S0 is the initial state, and from there we transition into the first real state. In the first real state we emit the first observation, we transition into the next state. That's how we go through the HMM and assign, in doing so, probability to ultimately underlying the joint probability for the sequence, the state sequence and the observation sequence. But here we're already in the variant where we actually search for a state sequence given an observation sequence, which we had derived through an application of Bayes' theorem. And now comes the recursive decomposition. We introduce a cache of probabilities for time point I and state x, where v sub I of x represents the maximum probability of being in state x at time point I, given that we have seen the prefix of the observation sequence O1 to OI at that point. And assuming that we have that we know up to the preceding time point what was the best path into any of the available states, we can now say from there the next step is to consider all continuations into my current state x from a previous state k at time point I minus 1. So I look up from the cache the best, well, the maximum probability corresponding to the best path into that state. Transition from there, from k to x, that's a transition probability, and then emit the current ith observation. So that's just a reformulation that enables us the application of dynamic programming. And to actually track, so what we compute here is the maximum probability. But we also want to keep track of the path that actually leads to that maximum probability. So here is the animated graphic, where initially I don't have any choices. The red dotted lines are the back pointers. Here I get a choice, I take the max and then record which path gave me the maximum value, and do so for all states. I fill in this two-dimensional matrix. At the end of the day, I can just trace back, it's like breadcrumbs that I've left myself, and now I can read out the corresponding state sequence. That's the Viterbi algorithm. Is that crystal clear? Good. We'll make it even more clear or a little more fuzzy by finally looking at another of the many tasks I said we can solve using HMMs. So what we just did was what is often called decoding, searching for S given O, maximizing P of S given O. Now we'll look at this task, assigning a probability to an observation sequence O, and that's what we said last week. We could also call HMM-based language modeling. So we had n-gram language models. This is actually an HMM language model, where n-gram language models are Markov models. Now we have a hidden layer in addition. So that's our task. Given O, determine the likelihood P of O according to an HMM. And if you think back to very basics of probability theory, throwing two dice, the probability of summing 2 6. That probability was the sum of the probabilities of all individual combinations that sum to 6. I think there were 2 or 3. And so we instantiate the same rule when there are multiple ways of arriving at the same outcome. Then the probability of that outcome is the sum of all the ways that give that result. And to us, the different ways that can give rise to the observation sequence are different hidden state sequences. So we sum over all possible state sequences the joint probability of O and S, and that sums to the probability of the observation sequence. So for example, for the ice cream sequence 313, there are how many different state sequences? 8, 2 to the third. Sorry, one of you actually said, don't ask questions and then don't wait for us to give the answer. I like that actually, I should respect it. But then I need to be a little more careful not asking trivial questions, I guess. Picking my questions more carefully. So there are 8 different state sequences, 2 times 2 times 2. And I can compute the probability, the joint probability for each of them and sum. There's a problem in that approach. 2 to the third is exponential growth. With more states, longer sequences, that will not be tractable. So exactly the same reasoning that led us to the Viterbi algorithm applies here. And again, we use the same basic solution. We decompose our problem into a recursive formulation and introduce a trellis, a store for intermediate values alpha, time point I, state x, which records the probability of being in that state after seeing the first I observations. Quite parallel to Viterbi. But the difference is that what we record in alpha is the probability of being there, not the best probability of getting there, but effectively the probability of being in that state given all possible ways of getting there for the prefix of the observation sequence. That is, we sum over all preceding states k at time point I minus 1, transition probability from k to x, emission probability in x, omit o I. And we sum all of these together. That will be the probability, the sum of all possible ways of getting into that state at that time point. And the diagram will be very similar. The only difference is that what I now record in each cell, or associated to each cell, sorry, this should be alpha. So these are the small deficiencies in my current slides. What I now record is the sum of getting, say here, from either this preceding state at the preceding time point or this preceding state, and I compute the probability of getting here from either one and then add them, sum them together. That follows my recursive formulation. And then there's no need for back pointers, because in this case what I'm actually primarily interested in is that sum. Because in the final state I will have computed the sum over all possible ways of traversing this graph, and at each point or in each intermediate state emitting the corresponding observation. So I obtain the same complexity reduction. There's a one pass linear in the length of the input computation that just fills in this matrix. It's parallel to Viterbi, but interesting, different in minor but interesting ways. And I would suggest that you sort of try to feel comfortable with what is parallel and what is different. So there we have the probability of this state sequence. So now we've used an HMM as a language model with a hidden layer. In principle, a more powerful language model, because it has additional information. Also a language model that is harder to train, because it needs gold standard training data to estimate its parameters. So I can train an n-gram language model on raw running text that I can crawl off the web, for example. I can't do that for an HMM-based language model. I think practically, for all I can tell nowadays, n-gram-based language models are predominant. I mean, because of this trade-off. So if you had some constraints, say on a mobile or embedded device, and didn't have the technical ability to store a giant language model, trained on, because the more training data, the more parameters, the more n-gram probabilities make up the model. So if you somehow wanted to preserve space, then I imagine the additional structure might actually be helpful. Because the HMM as a language model has the ability to model probabilities sort of in terms of word classes. Det n will always be a much more plausible thing to expect than det, two determinants following each other. The n-gram language model has to capture that at the level of individual words. So there's the additional ability to generalize, but it's counter set by the much higher requirement on training data. Raw text is the rare instance of supervised machine learning where there's hardly any limit on available training data. So I'm not aware of applications of HMM-based language models today. I think in earlier speech recognition days, they actually had some prominence. There are also class-based language models. So there's more than these two. So you can apply clustering and then actually build n-gram models over those clusters, and then interpolate word form-based and class-based language models. But in current statistical machine translation, n-gram language models over word forms to pretty large n's are what wins you the pot. So it's very hard to actually in research to compete with Google, because they can push that parameter much further than any university research group. And then the techniques to approximate language models to, again, not store every individual parameter, but to essentially compress them. Somewhat related in spirit to hashing and called Bloom filters. So this entire language models are actually very important, and sort of we give you the basics, and in actual applications there are more subtleties of smoothing, and there are more subtleties of representation. Oops. Okay, so I think let's take a break here, and we'll actually start after the break, 14 past, with the quiz. So please be back on time. Okay, let's get going. A quiz coming up. So, excitement everywhere. We'll take a high-tech approach, not the playful Kahoot. You won't need anything but a pen. Everyone should have a Post-it. This is, from our point of view, both to get you engaged, to give you an opportunity to reflect on where you stand. These are potentially exam-relevant questions. And to make it worth your while, this will be an individual quiz. And you can actually score bonus points. So by getting everything, there are 4 questions, half a point on each of them. You can score 2 bonus points, 2 extra points. But there are conditions on the use of these points. You can only use them to make up missing points on your obligatory assignments. So it's not possible to score 10 points on 3A, 2 points on the quiz, and be done. But it's possible to score 8 points on 3A, 2 on the quiz, and then 2 on 3B and qualify for the exam. So this is a way for you to complement for missing points on your assignments, not for you to avoid doing the assignments. And I'll give you 4 questions. You'll have 2 minutes each to, for each question, and each of you, you'll have 2 minutes to find your answer. And I would like you to prepare a Post-it. So this is your submission. I'll come collect these. And write clearly your name, your username, and then 1 line for each question. There will be 4, so you'll need a little extra space, and the answer. And OE is my username. So I expect that yours is different. Up to 2 bonus points towards exercise 2 or 3. Everyone has a Post-it. Write your first and last name. Username is how we find you in Devilry. Each answer on a line of its own. And since this is an exam-related activity, you know that we're very strict about those in Norway. So it has to be individual. You must not consult with your neighbor. It has to be no cheating. And to get something out of it that goes beyond bonus points, after the quiz, when I say time is up, please put your Post-it to the front of your table. You can no longer change it. I'll come collect them. And I'll give you about 2 minutes again for each question to discuss with your neighbor or neighbors. And I think you should take the attitude that you're right, and you'll explain to your neighbor in a professional manner why you're right. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't, and then the discussion, I think, will be very valuable. And then I'll briefly wrap up with also offering my opinion on the questions. All right? No, this is just like the exam, so close the computer, put everything aside. You won't have time for that anyway. So here comes our first question. It's the Monty Hall problem. On a game show there are 3 doors. Behind 2 doors there's a goat. The 3rd door, or 1 door, has a car. The contestant selects a door, and of course most people hope to win the car. But once she has made up her mind, before she actually opens the door, the game show host opens one of the other doors. and there will always be a goat behind the door that is opened. And now the player, the contestant, has the choice of opening her original door or switching to the other unopened door. And I'm asking, what's the probability of finding the car when switching? Is that a good strategy or not? And with what probability will there be a car behind the unopened door? So all you write down is one number. It can be a decimal. Is it 1/10 or a half? Could play some music just like Kahoot, but I'm not sure that helps. A few people are still writing. Okay. 10 more seconds. I think everyone's done anyway. Then we move on. My second question on language modeling. Here's a piece of text, a corpus. Group members at the Language Technology Group, that's our research group here in the department, supervise a variety of topics for MSc projects in natural language processing. Many candidate projects are available online. Please go check. Please make contact with us. By December 1, you're expected to have lined up an MSc project and supervisor. So this is also self-advertisement. But there's a question. So this is our text, our training corpus. What is the probability, given this text, of the bigram, language technology, when ignoring case and punctuation and using Laplace smoothing? Count and calculate. Getting there? 30 more seconds. Okay, we're moving on. Third question on space, not time complexity, regarding the Viterbi algorithm. We've discussed its time complexity in relation to the number of distinct states, the size of the state set, and the length of the observation sequence, L and N. And I'm asking you, what is the order of growth for memory? What is the space complexity for the Viterbi algorithm relative to L and N? We're not thinking bytes or number of storage units required. Twenty more seconds. Time to move on. Final question. Viterbi versus forward algorithm. Here is the recursive formulation of the Viterbi algorithm. It's not that long ago that we saw it. And my question is, compared to this formulation, what's the difference? What is different in the forward algorithm? And which task does it compute? I think I'll only give you 30 seconds for this question. This is too easy. No. Take your time. Thirty more seconds. Okay, we're done. Before you put your post-it in front of you, I would ask that you put two more pieces of information on. Whether you thought this was easy, okay, or difficult, one word, easy, okay, or difficult, just at the bottom, scribble. And whether next time you would prefer Kahoot or Post-it. And now, I would like to ask that you put down your pencils, push your Post-it to the edge of your table. I'll come around, collect them. And I would ask that 2 or 3 people together compare their views on the first question while I make the round. Who is right? Listen now. Tack ska du ha. Oops. Any more post-its for me to collect? I have them all. Then let's give the answer jointly. What's the correct answer? Hello. Interactive, great. I have a little more lecturing I would like to do today. Okay, and we'll do this 4 times. You discuss, and then we go back to. That'll be hard. So, what's the correct answer? What's the probability of finding the car when switching? It could be 1/3, it could be 1/2, or 2/3, I imagine. Any suggestions? Well, everyone has heard the problem before. I suggested it as a bonus. It should be 2/3. Can you reason or explain why? Did you say on the first pick the chance of finding the car was 2/3 or 1/3? It's 2/3. Well, that's an interesting new. I mean, there's an interesting Wikipedia article. Many other. There's been quite a bit of discussion about this problem because many people find the solution utterly counterintuitive. So there's much more scientific depth to this discussion than you would first expect, given there is one correct obvious answer, or, well, obvious, one correct answer that we can formally argue for. But there are different ways of giving that answer. And I think you're just proposing a new one. So you're saying that the chance of picking a goat when opening one door is 2/3 because 2 of the 3 doors have a goat. And that doesn't change. All right. And that leaves only 1/3 of probability mass for the other door. Of goat probability. Yes. Okay. I think that's a valid argument. The argument I find maybe most intuitive is to say that obviously the chance of finding the car when you pick one of 3 is 1/3 randomly. But effectively, when the host has opened one of the 2 remaining doors, he's offering her the choice between her original door, 1/3, and 2 doors where we now know that one of them has the car. Well, the unopened door has the car. So the probability of the car being behind 2 doors is 2/3. And one of the 2 doors have been taken away by the host. And hence taking the other one from that set of 2 doors gives her the car with a 2/3 chance. That is personally there's also reasoning in actually using conditional probabilities and Bayes' theorem, but this explanation is the one I find most accessible. That effectively switching means getting to pick the car behind 2 doors compared to trying to get it behind just 1 door. She effectively opens 2 doors. All right, then, so we'll go back to discussion. Language modeling. We need to hurry a little. So But still, I think the discussion is maybe the most valuable part of the quiz. So please take a minute to talk with your neighbors and compare notes. Okay, to move on, I'll ask you to now discuss the third question and then the fourth, and then we'll jointly discuss all of them. So carry on. Please discuss the fourth question. Okay, now I need to ask you to return the floor to me. I hate doing this, but I need to ask you to defer the discussion, come back to it. So let's jointly wrap this up. I think in the interest of time, I'll actually give you my answers. So how do we compute the probability of bigrams? We count the occurrence of the bigram. Language technology occurs how often? Once. And normalize to the counts of the prefix, the conditioning context, technology given language. Language occurs twice. So without smoothing, language technology would have a probability of 0.5. Smoothing, we add 1 to the observed count. So that becomes 2. And we normalize by adding the size of the vocabulary. So 1 plus 1 over 2 plus, I think it's 28. Sorry? Well, okay, if you count the period as a token, I think that gets you to 29. I don't see how you... So, I mean, language counts only once, and projects counts only once. It's distinct tokens, not the total length of the text. Yeah. Okay, any questions? Right. The probability of... That's a distinction I hadn't even considered. So you're saying that the probability of the bigram can mean two things. It can mean the bigram probability in a bigram language model, technology given language, or it could be the probability of language technology occurring in text. And so we get to participate in more of your discussion. That's certainly what... Well, the formula that we actually looked at earlier today is to compute the conditional probability of wi given wi minus m. Yeah. And that is certainly correct. So in that respect, I was certainly thinking of the conditional probability in the n-gram language model, the thing that we looked at even earlier today. I'm currently actually unsure whether the conditional and the joint probability will be different in this setup. And how Laplace smoothing would apply, if at all, to compute to the joint probability. I think I'd like to actually take this under advisement rather than improvise, and proceed for now. 2 over 30, I think. 1 over 16 or 60? 16. And if you write, so 1 over 16 is not the same as 2 over 30. and in 2 minutes, can you count to 28? So why I'm not promising you to give you full score on 1 over 16 is because I suspect you counted language twice and projects twice, which would get you to 30 as a wrong vocabulary size plus 2. And then you would be looking at 2 over 32 or 1 over 16. And that would be not V, but the number of tokens, not the number of distinct. Okay, then it's possible that you miscounted. And so what we'll do is we'll look through your answers and post results on Devilry as an additional entry. And then we'll be open to discussions. But our philosophy is that extra points are hard to earn. So we are less lenient in the extra points than we are otherwise. Let's move on. So the memory required by the Viterbi algorithm is effectively the size of the matrix that we're filling in. And that is a two-dimensional matrix with dimensions L and n plus 2. You might say we need two matrices of that size because we also need the back pointers. So here we'll consider several answers correct, but it's essentially at the core of the order of space growth is L times n. That rectangle. Finally, I felt I had ended up spending more time on answering this question just before the break than I should have done when asking it, but still I'm seeing many empty answers here. So I had expected this to be easy. The difference between Viterbi and forward is that Viterbi sums rather than maximizes. It adds. And what it computes is the likelihood of the observation sequence, or P of O. All right, I'll take this with me and post results tonight or tomorrow, and then I'll be happy to talk to you more about the space of choices. Okay? Then let me use the final 15 minutes to get us started on our last segment in this trinity of tasks we set out to, problems we set out to solve. We can now talk mathematically about the likeliness, the probability of strings and of labeled sequences. Let's turn to syntactic structures. Let's introduce essentially grammar, and in our case, so we're moving from sequences from linear order, where n-gram language models or Markov chains are simple one-layer sequences. Hidden Markov models are two-layer. They're still sequential in nature, but they allow us one hidden layer of essentially analysis, of generalization, of assigning parts of speech, word categories. Now we're taking a big jump. We're leaving the space of sequences. We're moving to trees, much richer structures as a data type, which give us hierarchical structure or dominance, embedding. And this move is motivated by natural language processing as one of its ultimate goals, pursuing natural language understanding. Often we say natural language processing because we're still fairly far removed from actual understanding. But that is the ultimate goal, and we'll take the position and argue briefly that to actually make sense of language, you need to consider of natural language, any language, you need to consider its grammatical structure. To make sense of a computer program, you need to parse it into its syntax tree. So it's the same operation transformed to natural languages. And that means we move from sequences to structures, and that is specifically tree structures. And the motivating notion here, now I have 3 slides on Linguistics 101, basic theory of formal grammar or syntax. And the basic notion that we'll invoke is that of constituency, of forming meaningful groups. And a constituent is a group of words or other constituents that jointly behave like single units. And we'll have a number of constituency tests. Again, just like with parts of speech, this is a little bit of general linguistic background so that you can then more easily accept and swallow the structures that we'll actually compute. We'll very soon move back to computation, that is to parsing using formal grammars. That will be our remaining lectures. So constituency tests essentially confirm that this group of things is a meaningful unit, and the three classic tests that I'm giving you here is they're interchangeable in similar contexts. I can take a constituent of one type and replace it with another constituent of the same type. They can be coordinated. I can take constituents of the same type and say x and x, that's coordination, and I can move them around as a single unit. So here are some examples. Kim read a very interesting book about grammar. What I've bracketed here is a constituent that I'll call NP, noun phrase, and I can replace that long string with a very short pronoun, it. Kim read it. So I can put something else into that same context, and that has the same constituent category. That's also a noun phrase. Two different types of noun phrases that fit into the same context. I can coordinate. Kim read a book, gave it to Sandy, and left. So three bracketed units here that I call VP verb phrase, and that I can iterate and conjoin using commas and conjunction. So they are constituents of the same category. Or slightly more involved, you said I should read the book, and read it, I did. So here I have read the book, again a verb phrase, and as a constituent, as a single unit, I can move that around into this construction in English where I take a verb phrase and say I did. These are taken from this book down here, which is a gentle introduction to morphology and syntax. If you want to read something that is slightly more thorough and deeper and linguistically careful than the discussion in Jurafsky and Martin. But Jurafsky and Martin is fully adequate for our purposes. They motivate constituents much along the same lines as we do here. Constituents are not things I can observe. They're part of my building a theory about the structure of natural language, and hence it's the theory that determines what I consider a constituent, how many different types of constituent I assume. And linguists argue about differences in syntactic theories happily and at length. Constituents are language specific, so they are language specific and theory specific. They are part of me building a model, a hypothesis about the grammatical structure of a given language. They're often very useful in talking about word order, one of the basic elementary properties of grammar that we need to learn for a given language. Norwegian is often called, like German, a verb second language. You may have heard that. Mannen som jeg traff I går smilte pent. Smilte is the verb in the main clause here. And that was not in the second position, was it? And yet we call Norwegian a verb second language. It is in the second position if what we count are constituents. So mannen som jeg traff I går is a noun phrase. It's a very long description of that man. It's a noun phrase that includes a relative clause. So in that respect, Norwegian is verb second, but here we're counting constituent positions, not individual words. Han smilte pent, so there the initial constituent is just one word, but I can make that arbitrarily long and still the verb goes into the immediately following position. Um, and we'll often assume or talk about one element in a constituent as its head, in a sense the defining, the most important member of the group. And the names we give to constituents mirror these. So a noun phrase, NP, has a noun type head. A very interesting book about grammar is a long NP. And we'll say that book, a very interesting book about grammar is a book. So book, the noun book, is the head of this NP. Gives books to students. It's what we'll call a verb phrase. A verb phrase still needs a subject to form a sentence. Kim gives books to students would be a sentence. And the head of that verb phrase is the verb, because the verb determines how many objects it takes and determines the meanings of the whole thing and how things hang together. So that's the notion of heads. And typically we can sort of look at the constituent label, the type, and read off the head. Grammatical functions, notions like subject and object, in this view on syntax, essentially are derived notions, and they tell us something about the position of a constituent in a larger structure. The subject in an English sentence will be the noun phrase in the initial, the first noun phrase daughter in an S node. We'll see examples of that. Another important linguistic term, agreement, congruence, is a relationship, symmetric relationship between grammatical properties of two units. For example, the decision of the Nobel Committee members surprises most of us. Why do I have surprises here? Because it's the decision that surprises. It surprises us. It's not the members surprise us. So with a plural subject, the finite verb would be in the plural. They surprise us. With a singular subject, the finite verb is in the present tense in the singular form. She surprises us. And we've constructed this example because it should be intuitive that if we modeled this phenomenon of agreement, the choice of verb form down here, purely in terms of sequential constraints, then we would be tempted to say, well, here is a plural noun, we should have a plural verb. Typically, when a finite verb follows a noun, then the agreement holds between these two units. But here I have just made the subject NP more complex, and it's actually the head word of the subject noun phrase that determines the agreement with the verb. And to capture this, to enable a computer to actually predict this, to generate grammatical English, let's say, and translating into English, or to work out how things hang together, we need these notions of constituents, structures, and heads. So that's the general motivation. And verb agreement, as we argue here or observe here, is a property, is something that I can immediately observe in the grammatical syntactic structure, and not just when looking at the juxtaposition, the sequencing of words. Pretty drawing for the two readings of time flies like an arrow that we know already. So so far what we've said about grammar, a lot of that we also find in compiler technology, in the syntax of formal languages, in the syntax of algebraic expressions. What is peculiar to natural languages is ambiguity. One string can have multiple different interpretations, and we will assume that different interpretations correspond to different grammatical structures. So to us, grammars are a tool to understanding on multiple layers. for one, we have good intuitions about what can go into these slots. Kim was happy because she passed the exam, or maybe he, but in my universe, Kim is a girl's name. Kim was happy because her final grade was an A. So different forms of the pronoun in different contexts. And that is knowledge of grammar and the computer generating language better. I mean, it's a variant of the pronoun she in both cases, but it has to fit into the context. Otherwise, Kim was happy because she final grade was an A. We can barely make sense of that. Kim was happy because her passed the exam. A little better, but not good English. In terms of understanding, different structures will correspond to different interpretations. And I think I challenge you to form an opinion about how many different interpretations you can assign to this string. Have her report on my desk by Friday. Might be a quiz question at one point. This one we've seen, variants of the prepositional phrase ambiguity. Sushi with tuna or eating with chopsticks. So we'll now make that explicit as different syntactic structures. And ultimately, syntax is a tool to associate representations of meaning, semantics, to natural language utterances. So all of these three sentences all describe the same situation. And there are three different syntactic forms, but I would like all three to arrive at the same meaning representation. So some abstract logical form that says, well, there was a transfer of a book from Kim to Sandy. Effectively, that's what this means. That is what these three sentences mean. Okay, so that was our introduction to formal grammar. I need to stop here. And next week we'll turn to parsing, to structural analysis using formal grammars of natural language. See you then.